Back in one of my first guitar lessons, I was presented with a box full of pentatonic scales. There was no emphasis on the sound, we just played them. Later on for me, classical piano lessons, well, they were marginally better, with the written staff having more musical emphasis. But for both guitar and piano, I was being given scales without much musical context and without the essential ear training needed for me to be able to apply those scales over a chord progression. So in the end, what provided me with a more musical relationship with scales? In today's video, I want to share with you 3 things that help me move on beyond these shaky musical foundations. Before we get started, the PDFs from today's lesson are available on my website. Please check the description where you'll also find a link to my Patreon page. I started playing guitar when I was 13 years old, and it wasn't until I was 18 that I got hold of Mick Goodrick's incredible book, The Advancing Guitarist. And this book really helped me see the fretboard differently and helped me learn scales in a new and more musical way. Mick suggests that you practice your modes, your scales on one string. He calls it the Unitar. And the beauty of practicing a scale like this is it makes it piano-like, in the sense more linear, and it's much easier to understand the intervals and recognise the distances. Say if I play a C major scale on one string like this, versus imposition. For someone newer to the instrument, whenever they cross the string mid-scale, it's much harder to understand the interval relationship between those 2 notes than it is, say, on one string. From this time, whenever I learned a new scale, I would always lay it out on one string to begin with. I'd take the time to understand the intervallic pattern, and I would also practice in a couple ways. I would play the first note, sing the next note, then play to check I've got it right, and carry on up the scale in this way. That way I'm really developing my ear rather than just my fingers. I'd know I was getting somewhere with a scale when I could just play the root note and then sing the entire scale. If you practice your scales like this on one string and you sing, and then you practice the scale without the instrument, you just get to that point with the scale where you know what the next note's going to sound like before you play it. And what I learned the hard way is if I couldn't sing it, then I didn't know it. And if my fingers know it, it's not much use to me musically, it is purely technical. So if you haven't already tried this, why don't you try playing a scale you already know on one string, or the next scale you learn, or arpeggio even. Do it like this. Then if you want to extend that activity, try soloing on one string. Limitations like that can be so liberating. They force us to be more musical, they force us to be more creative, and they take away the option to just rely upon fingers going to places they know. I'd be surprised if you didn't find yourself playing from a more musical place than, say, muscle memory scale positions. You'll no longer be stuck in the box. If you haven't yet got yourself a copy of Mick's book, The Advancing Guitarist, then I've put an Amazon link to my Amazon store of the book. Now, if you did purchase through that link, just a heads up, it's an affiliate link, so I get a very, very small commission at no extra cost to you, so it's just another way to support my channel and my videos. Now, I spent a lot of time shredding away at the 5 positions of the major scale, the 5 positions of the minor pentatonic, and so forth. Now, I don't discount that that was good for my overall technique, but it wasn't a very musical way to practice in hindsight. What I came to realise is that practicing like this, it just attaches scales to chords. So you see in A minor, oh, I'll play A minor pentatonic. Oh, and what a coincidence, I start from the note A. In the heat of the moment, I feel like scale positions, they take us to shapes, and they maybe reduce the potential for melodic playing to happen. And I eventually realised that what's better than the 5 or 7 positions is actually being able to just find that scale from the different roots on the fretboard. So take the C major scale. We could play it from C on the low E, the A string, the D string, G string, and so on. But even with that, it's still quite rigid, and really to improvise we need to be flexible with our musical tools and the sounds at our disposal. And that's where I realised what people are able to do, they're able to apply scales very musically, is they can be flexible with how they play them. Take the C major scale off the low E string here. That encourages you to start with your second finger. So why not practice it with the little finger, which will be in a different position, right? It'll be in position 5 on the guitar, whereas starting with the middle finger is in position 7. Start with the index finger. See if you can make that scale work. So basically what finger I start with will determine how I play the scale. And it might be different each time. This kind of practice is much better at preparing you for improvising because you're being flexible with how you play these scales rather than stuck in a rigid way, which means, you know, you'll be very rigid when you improvise. Oh, C major, oh, it's there. Whereas really you want your ear to be working at creating melodies, and you can be flexible about how you find the sounds you're tapping into over that chord. And I think a really great test of how well you know the sound of a scale is this next activity. Rather than seeking out positions, seek out the sound. And I call this the no position approach. For example, let's say I wanted to practice C mixolydian. Let's start for E's on the A string at fret 3. I want to finish at fret 20 on the high E string. I'm going to play C mixolydian. I'm not sure how I'm going to get there. I could play 5 notes on one string, 1 note on a string, but I'm just going to follow the sound of the scale from one C to a much higher C. And I'm relying upon my ear as to where the sound of the next note is. You can pre-hear that next note before it comes in. It doesn't matter how many notes you play on a string, it's entirely up to you. What you want to end up with is playing a scale in a way you've never ever played it before, and you might never play it like that quite the same way again. And the overall theme of today is two things. It's being more reliant upon your ear than your fingers, and it is moving away from playing positions to a more flexible approach to finding the sounds of scales on your fretboard. And for me, this is about preparing ourselves for the challenge of improvisation, because take the word position, I'd associate other words like that with rigid and set, words you wouldn't associate with good soloing. And the practice methods I've worked through and I'm suggesting here today are about preparing you to do what you need to be able to do on your instrument. So that's my feeling on learning scales on the guitar. It's taken me a while to come around to this kind of approach. You might not be ready for some of these concepts yet. You might still be developing your basic scale technique, but it's good to know of ways to push yourself forward with this further down the line. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to learning scales in a musical way, then I do have an ebook on my website, C Major Practice for the Jazz Guitarist. Thank you for getting to the end of today's video. Please leave a comment, hit that like button if you've gained value from today's video. Remember, jazz guitar lessons every Wednesday. Links to the resources in the description, as well as a link to my Patreon page. Until next time, you take care.